Hello, welcome to the fourth lesson of our Soviet Union politics course. In this lesson we're going to cover the period between 1953 and 1964, which we can generally kind of refer to as the Khrushchev period. It starts off in 1953, so Stalin dies, somewhat fittingly, because his doctors are too scared to help him in case he recovers and then kills them. So generally speaking, we can say it's quite a good thing that Stalin died. But this obviously sparks a leadership struggle. There is this huge power vacuum where before there has been someone with power stretching right across the Soviet Union, and that's just now been removed. There are three contenders for power. It's actually these three men, and Molotov, who was the foreign secretary, who gave the eulogy at Stalin's funeral. There's Malenkov, who had the role of premier, which means that he was in charge of what I've been referring to as the state. There's Beria, who's in charge of the MVD, which is another name for the NKVD, so he's in charge of the secret police. And then there's Khrushchev, who is the general secretary in charge of the Politburo. So last lesson I said that these three aspects of the power structure in the Soviet Union were going to have to compete, and this is exactly what's happening here. And Beria, in an attempt to get ahead, to try and prove that he's not going to murder the other two, goes ahead and begins to reform, but we'll have a look at that in a second. The other two see that Beria probably isn't worth trusting, and they have him murdered in June of 1953, right after he puts in place his reforms. Following the death of Beria then, in 1953, there is a triumvirate between Malenkov and Khrushchev, and they can actually agree on a few things. So they can agree that it was important to humanise communism, to get rid of this cult of personality of Stalin, and begin to move towards a communism not so focused on this one leader. However, Khrushchev actually begins to move power away from Malenkov's seat of power. So rather than having the single state apparatus in Moscow, he begins to devolve powers away to the various other countries in the Soviet Union, which means that Malenkov was unable to retain his seat as premier. It was also in some part because Khrushchev was doing so well. He had schemes like the Virgin Land scheme, which was seen to be quite successful at the time. So what happens is Malenkov loses his job as premier. He's replaced by a guy called Bulgarin. He's replaced by a guy called Bulgarin, who is loyal to Malenkov. This isn't the end of the leadership struggle though. In 1957, there is an uprising within the Presidium. The Presidium, sorry again to use a different word, but the Presidium is the new name for the Politburo. There is a vote in the Presidium to remove Khrushchev as leader. He says, no, you can't get rid of me as leader. You need to go to the Central Committee. The Central Committee was the body which elected the Politburo, so kind of like the Party Congress. He was very clever to do this because in fact he had a majority in the Central Committee and he successfully ousted the anti-party group. The anti-party group is a name he used to talk about Malenkov because he thought that that was going to make him seem as if they were malicious. Moving on then, let's have a look at some of the reforms which not only underline the leadership struggle, but also came about after Khrushchev's victory in 1953. I spoke very briefly about the Beria reforms, but they occurred in 1953, and they kind of had two arms, I guess. The first of which, looking at gulags. So between 1953 and 1956, 800,000 people were released from gulags. Gulags, if you don't know, are big prisons, prison labour camps. That's where Stalin sent a lot of the people he didn't like during the purges. There is also changes to the republics. I haven't really gone through this in detail before in this course, but the Soviet Union is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And what that means is it's not just Russia, it's lots of different countries like Azerbaijan. There's a difference between like the satellite states and the republics. So just make sure you know that, I guess. I might go through that in more detail in a later video. But anyway, so he gives more power to the republics. And he does this by ensuring that the ambassadors from Moscow to the republics know how to speak the language that they speak there, but also that political documents and like leaflets and stuff are not only given in Russian, but also in the native language spoken there. Then we have decentralization. What I mean by that is when I spoke about how Malenkov ended up losing, Khrushchev begins to give more power to the republics, but he also begins to move away from this idea of a central party controlling everything. We see this a lot in his economic policies, which we'll go on to in the next part of the course, but for the most part, it's all about Khrushchev saying, let's give power to smaller branches across the Soviet Union. 4.1 million people join as members. Khrushchev targeted workers and peasants to join the party. This was for two main reasons. So first off, he understands that if he gives good jobs to people, if he encourages people to be politically active, they're going to be useful to him and support him. But secondly, he wanted to appeal more to the people. He was really keen on not being distant. He wanted it to be seen as if the people are really pushing rather than just the politicians. So going back to the idea of decentralization, by 1954, the central government ministries have reduced from 55 to 25, and again, this is all just about distributing power. With Stalin, you had everything in one place, in particular with one guy, but now it's moving across geographically. There's also what I like to call the split between hammer and sickle in the Communist Party. So with the hammer and sickle, there is industrialization and then there's agriculture. And what Khrushchev decided was that he was going to split people working on agriculture from people working in industry. This doesn't actually make sense, as we'll look at later on, because when you look at his economic policy, it was actually quite important for the two aspects to work together, but he thought that this was going to be somewhat more productive. And finally, by 1962, he decides to put in fixed terms for politicians, and these were 16-year fixed terms for members of the Central Committee. This again was to try and seem as if he was being a reformer, although it kind of doesn't make sense, because if he's put lots of people in power which are loyal to him, if he puts fixed terms, it's going to annoy them, and so we can see why he ended up getting sacked later on. Looking now at Khrushchev in particular, and also de-stalinisation, even back in 1953, one of the few things that Malenkov and Khrushchev agreed on was the idea of de-stalinisation. This included the end of Stalin's celebrations, so the end of celebrating his birthday as a national holiday, also the end of the Stalin prizes or awards, and there used to be like quotes from Stalin in newspapers, but it was decided that we should get rid of them and replace them with Lenin's quotes and Marx's quotes. When we talk about de-Stalinisation, there's one event which is seen as really quite important, and that is the secret speech of 1956. This was all about Khrushchev speaking to members of the party and saying, look, this is what happened under Stalin. There were purges. His policy during the war made it very hard for us to win. But importantly, he did not criticise Stalin's economic policies, particularly in regards to agriculture and industry. One of the major effects of the secret speech was the riots and protests in Hungary and Poland, as well as domestically. People people were quite shocked actually to realise how bad things were. And so in Hungary and Poland, you had attempts to get rid of the communist governments. These were quashed, and so a lot of people within the Soviet Union and within Moscow, they were very scared of giving any kind of reforms because they thought that if things were going to kick off again like they did in Hungary and Poland, that it wasn't worth trying. And finally, in 1962, it is decided by Khrushchev that he again wants to push forward with de-stalinisation. In between these 2 points, he thinks that it's not worth actually pursuing de-stalinisation, and that is because things have gone so poorly in Hungary and Poland. In 1957, in fact, in January of 1957, he turns around and says, all communists are Stalinists. He thinks that the people aren't ready for de-stalinisation, but he changes his mind in 1962 and goes on to say that Stalin was responsible for Kirillov's murder. This is also, as we saw here, when he pushed for fixed terms in the Central Committee. However, by 1964, he has been sacked as leader of the Soviet Union. This was for a few reasons. So first off, his economic policies went sour. He was an awful diplomat. You can find online all kinds of stories about him. One being that he thought that Disneyland was being used to fire nuclear missiles. He's also quite famous for saying, "We will bury you," which in fact was an error of translation. You can also find some stories about him taking his shoe off and banging it on a table at a UN meeting. However, those are kind of in dispute. Regardless though, he manages to annoy enough of the party through his reforms that they decide they don't like him anymore. And that's why I was kind of talking about the fixed terms here, because he annoys the people who he needs to support him, which in theory makes him a good leader, because a good leader does what's right. But he's not a very good politician, and that's why he gets sacked. It's quite likely that if Khrushchev comes up, or at least the political side of Khrushchev comes up in the exam, they're going to ask you about changing continuity. And that is because between Stalin and between Khrushchev, there's actually quite a lot of change. The biggest change is the end of terror. And we can see this right throughout what we've talked about. For example, the anti-party group in 1957 opposes him. He does not do what Stalin would do and just murder everyone who dared to say that he wasn't a good leader. And this is in some part because it's an ideological thing. He doesn't think that terror is a good way to run a state. But secondly, the MVD, or the secret police, has been totally weakened because of the Gulag reforms and because Beria himself was killed. Terror never again will be a part of the Soviet Union because of Khrushchev's attempts to reform. The party takes more control. You don't have what happened with Stalin, where he is leader of the party and leader of the state and leader of a war cabinet and basically leader of the secret police. All the power is concentrated within the party. The state is much weaker now. So the power dynamic within the Soviet Union changes. There's decentralization, and this comes in 2 forms that we've talked about. So the first is the geographical decentralization of there being less central party branches and more localized party branches. But secondly, there's also the decentralization of agriculture and industry. So economic planning is no longer centralized, it's split up and a bit more specialized. There's also changes in loyalty and patronage. Khrushchev recognizes that it is important to get people who like you in place of power. That's why Bulgarin was made premier. However, he decides also that in the interest of having a state which actually gets stuff done, it makes sense to have fixed terms, and it makes sense to get rid of people that might support you. This changes under Brezhnev, and we'll begin to look at the effect of that. And finally, the weakening of the leader. Khrushchev, for all his his positive reforms, all his failures, he was always kind of asking the party for permission. He was not this strong leader like Stalin who could do whatever he wanted. And I think it actually speaks to his success as a reformer that he ended up getting sacked, because he ended up weakening his own position so much that other people could kick him out of his job. By the end of this period, Khrushchev has changed Soviet politics to get rid of a lot of Stalin's influence. However, he does not do anywhere near as much to get rid of the cult of personality Stalin had. And although all of this stuff was happening in the executive, the elite political circles, it was not happening to the average person. So these are all things we can consider when we look at Khrushchev, the reformer. I hope this has been useful. The politics side of Khrushchev is much drier, I would say, than some of the economics and other things we're going to look at. But I think it's important to look at the transition from Stalin to Khrushchev. And in the next video, we're going to look at Brezhnev. I hope to see you again next time.